You don't need tens of thousands of dollars in order to make big money from a podcast. But there is one thing that you need in order to make big money from a small podcast. This is Grow the Show, the podcast that grows your podcast. My name is Kevin Schmidlin. I am your podcast growth coach. And today I'm going to share with you the top way I have seen podcasts that have fewer than 5,000 downloads per episode make thousands of dollars per month without getting any sponsors. Now, I am in my fifth year of helping podcasts grow. I've worked with big shows that make a lot of money, big shows that make no money, small shows that make no money, and small shows that make a lot of money. And you'd be surprised by how many big shows make no money, and you'd be even more surprised at how many small shows make a lot of money. It's not as correlated as you might think. So, what is the difference? In particular, what do the small shows do to make big money? Well, the first thing that you need to understand is this. There is only one way to monetize a podcast. And yes, you might have heard of a bunch of ways to monetize a podcast, but the truth that I have found and that I believe is that the only way to monetize a podcast audience is by getting that audience to buy something. That is it. Full stop. Literally any podcast monetization technique that you heard of boils down somehow to your audience buying something. So if you get a sponsor, that monetization strategy will only be successful long-term if your audience buys the sponsor stuff. Same thing, there are some of you out there who are charging your guests to appear on your show. The reason those guests are paying you to appear on your show is so that your audience buys their thing. Literally every single strategy translates to you build an audience, you get that audience to buy something, and you get a cut of the revenue generated from them buying that thing, okay? So in order to monetize any podcast, you need to get your audience to buy something. But there are tons of podcasts out there, and maybe yours is one of them, that are technically monetized. Maybe they've gotten one sponsorship. Maybe they've launched a $10 membership that has 3 members. You know, it's their mom and their 2 friends from college, but they are monetized. We're not talking about those. But the question is, how are those podcasts different than the podcasts that make the big money? Well, I'm going to tell you about 2 shows. Both shows have 2,000 downloads per episode or less and are making big money. One of those shows has a back-end business, meaning that there is a company behind the podcast, but the other show does not. It's just one guy. Both shows, however, do the same thing to make big money. So I'll tell you about the solo podcaster first. This podcaster has a fishing show, and the podcaster has a full-time job doing something else. So he makes his fishing show part-time. And that show gets about 1,000 downloads per episode, which in the grand scheme of things, it's way bigger relatively than people think. But either way, people think that is a small podcast. And it truthfully is way too small in order to make big money from regular sponsorships, right? But this podcaster does make big money. He has made more than $100,000 in a year from his podcast without building a business around his podcast. So how did he do it? Well, it's simple. He has one partnership with a boat dealership. People who fish need boats, right? Unless you're a fly fisherman, I guess. But people who fish on boats need boats. So this podcaster has a deal with a boat dealership where anytime one of his listeners buys a boat from that dealership, he gets 10% of the sale. Now, I am not a boater. I had to look this up, but Google tells me that boats cost between $15,000 and $75,000 before you get into the luxury range. So that means that if this podcaster makes 10%, that he gets $1,500 to $7,500 per sale. So it just takes one audience member, one listener to buy a boat in order for him to make multiple $1,000s. And so if we average that together and we say his average commission over time is $4,500, then in order for him to make 6 figures per year, he only needs to have 2 sales come through per month. And I can hear you now, but Kevin, that's a lot of sales if his audience is only 1,000 downloads per episode. And yes, that is true. However, his audience isn't 1,000 per episode. His downloads are 1,000 per episode. There is a difference. His audience is probably closer to 10,000 or more because remember, the number of downloads per episode that you get is usually only 10 to 20% of your total audience size. And we want to track total audience size as we go. Okay, so that's show number 1. It is a solo part-time podcaster. He gets 1,000 downloads per episode about his hobby, and he makes up to 6 figures a year just by telling his listeners to buy their boats from this particular dealership. That's number 1. But what about the show that has a back-end business? Because I know a lot of you who pay attention to Grow the Show have businesses around your show. What does that one do that the other shows don't? Well, there's another podcaster who I work with who averages about 2,000 downloads per episode. Still pretty good, pretty solid, and he's done that for a long time. But it's definitely not as big as some of the really big names that you would assume are making tons of money. This podcaster has a back-end business around his show, meaning he has built a company around the show that offers a paid product. Now, that product is related to investing. It is an annual membership, and the membership costs about $8,000-ish per year. Now, believe it or not, that podcaster gets about 12 new members every month from his podcast. Do you know what that means? If you do some mental math, 12 times 8 times 12 means that his business makes over $1 million per year, and that business is largely driven by his podcast. Now, his podcast is not the only thing that he does. He has other marketing tactics. He has people helping him with sales. There is a company surrounding this podcast. But the point is, the podcast only does 2,000 downloads per episode. And so if you're a business owner who's feeling bad about how many downloads your podcast has and you think it should grow, you might already have far more downloads per episode than you need in order to make big money. So, having shared those two stories, do you notice what these two small podcasts have in common? One of them gets 1,000 downloads per episode. It is a hobby show done part-time, and it makes 6 figures a year with affiliate revenue. The other one gets about 2,000 downloads per episode and makes over 7 figures per year by selling and fulfilling a high-ticket membership. What do they both do? They sell something expensive. That is the secret, and that is how small podcasts make big money. They make big money from their small podcast by selling something expensive. Now, hold on. I can hear some of you now. That won't work for me. My audience doesn't have that kind of money. And I promise you, some of them do. My favorite example of people who sell expensive things to an audience that supposedly does not have a lot of money is influencers on Instagram. I know of several Instagrammers who have fairly decent audiences. It's not in the hundreds of thousands, maybe the thousands. And they are lifestyle influencers. They post about their life and they are making unbelievable amounts of money by selling something expensive. But their audience is people in their early 20s, which everybody assumes, these people don't have any money. They're super young, right? They're in college. And so you would think that these people can't sell something expensive to their audience. But I'm telling you now, there are tons of them who make big money by selling something to just 20 people. They just need 20 people out of their audience of several thousand to buy, and they make several $1,000s. And the most common example of that I see is actually destination trips. So there's a bunch of Instagrammers who will put together a trip to, Bali or Fiji or something like that. And they'll sell 20 spots on the trip. And the trip will cost like 10, 15 grand. And some of them are making more than 50% commission on those things. So one weekend they get to go to Fiji and they make 50, 60 grand just by hanging out with 20 of their audience members. Pretty cool, right? You would be floored at how many people in your audience that doesn't have money who do have money. And they're gonna spend it anyway. So they might as well spend it with you. Now, if you are somebody who already tries to sell something expensive, but your audience isn't buying the thing, like you're a business owner with a high ticket product or something like that, that is a different problem altogether. There's probably just a couple of tweaks that you need to make to get your podcast listeners to start buying your thing. And so if that's you, definitely check out the episode of Grow the Show that's about the content-driven business, and that should highlight what needs fixing there. But either way, no matter what kind of podcaster you are, the secret to making big money with a small podcast is by selling something expensive. So if you've never tried that, give it a thought, try and combat the fears that come up, and let me know once you start making big money from your small show.